whole new way of life that would stand in sharp contrast to life in Egypt. A whole new way of life that would stand in sharp contrast to life in Egypt. In fact, all of the Torah, as has been noted by a number of scholars, one of the better ones is also one of the ones out of print, the Bible against this environment shows how the Bible interacts with its historical context and presents us with material that stands in contrast with its environment. So a whole new way of life in sharp contrast to life in Egypt. Quick question, like the moon reflects the sun, this is sort of a somewhat extended metaphor, do we reflect just such a whole new life? You see, the sun is a symbol of constancy and power, the very image of Egypt. For 365 days a year, we trust the sun to rise and to set. In fact, the author of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Solomon, said there's nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. Because the sun is a symbol of constancy. Because the sun, if you would have it, oversees everything in an unchanging fashion. But friends, consider this. Under the moon, there is something new at least 12 times a year. And for us, this year, 13 times. If you haven't figured that out, I'll talk to you about that later. The moon is forever changing, getting smaller and smaller. And then just when it seems to have disappeared completely, there's a sudden turnaround. A rebirth in the heavens. Now, to the ancient world, the changing of the moon was a constant source of speculation, of wonder, of mystery. And it also served as a ray of optimistic faith that from the depths of darkness and disappearance, the light of rebirth and new hope will emerge. By the way, in the collection of mystical texts called the Zohar, I do not necessarily recommend that you read them, not at least until you've mastered the Talmud, so our traditions tell us. It compares the Jewish people to the moon because both the moon and the people of Israel go through phases, disappearing little by little until it seems that it's the end of the Jewish people. Yet we keep being born again. After each temple destruction, after Purim, even after the centuries-long exile climaxing in Europe's death factories, Yom HaShoah, suddenly a new moon is sighted, and messengers run eagerly to Jerusalem, literally, Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day. Now, the repetition of a monthly cycle, this change and rebirth, this time of growth and development, the repetition of the monthly cycle, firmly planted within the Jewish psyche the constant quest for renewal. We should be driven, as is the moon, by the constant quest for renewal. Renew our days as of old, we said. I hope we were serious. Our sanctity as a people and as a nation is tied to our potential for national and personal renewal. And our very history confirms this phenomenon, that when a Jewish civilization in one part of the world finds itself facing destruction, it seems almost simultaneously a new culture somewhere else emerges to replace it. The year was 1492. It marked the destruction of the Spanish Jews, but it also marked what? The discovery of American shelter for Jews to come. Now, historically, the commandment we've been talking about in Exodus 12 to sanctify the new moon is given when it is quite clear in the text by now that Pharaoh himself, the master under the Egyptian sun, he will not change like the sun he serves. So after 9 terrifying plagues, we might expect him to have a change of heart. But the leader of Egypt does not. He will not relent. Despite all that he's witnessed, he still refuses to let our people go. The message of this first commandment, then, is that in contrast to the Egyptians, Jews can and do change, emerging again and again as survivors from the jaws of evil, adapting to new times and new circumstances and situations. If our calendar, let me suggest, followed only the sun, who knows if we as a people might have proved as flexible as we have been. Flexible enough to withstand the ups and downs, the appearances and disappearances, implicit in that first commandment. But there's another significance to our fascination with the moon and the emphasis on Rosh Chodesh, and that is in a text. It's a special Haftorah portion that we read whenever Shabbat, Erev Shabbat, is also Erev Rosh Chodesh. It's the text from 1 Samuel 20. Now, this particular segment deals with that heartbreaking separation of Jonathan from his dearest friend David and David's secret escape from the threat of King Saul. Now, the reading of this particular segment and the occurrence of its events, the events of that segment surrounding Rosh Chodesh, suggest a connection, as the rabbis picked up on it, between the reign of David the king and Rosh Chodesh, the new month. In fact, many customs related to the new moon reinforce this association. Back to the Talmud. The Talmud tells us to recite a blessing over the new moon each month. Yet in the very middle of that blessing, we are instructed to say with excitement, David, Melech Yisrael, Chai, David, King of Israel, is alive and enduring. Now, this peculiar practice suggests that the moon and King David's reign have much in common. And one of the ancient midrashim, the rabbinic reflections or narratives concerning the biblical text, tells us that in actuality, hear me carefully, David's reign was patterned exactly according to the cycles of the moon. The Midrash notes that the moon is full on the 15th day, and then it gradually declines until it disappears totally. Once the moon is completely out of sight, it then begins its gradual reappearance. The Midrash goes on to explain that the reign of the house of David, the dynasty of David, resembled the appearance and disappearance of the moon. Like the moon, the glory of Israel's reign slowly began to appear in the time of Abraham and developed to its fullest maturity, as the rabbis calculated, 15 generations later in the era of David's son, King Solomon. And from that point on, the monarchy, like the moon, began its gradual descent until its total disappearance 15 kings later during the reign of Zedekiah, the king. The Midrash then concludes with a very striking statement that when the reign of King David will totally disappear, the time will be ripe for the gradual reappearance or the gradual appearance of the Messiah. And as the genealogy in Levi's Gospel, Matthew chapter 1, is careful to note, 14 generations later, in the 15th generation, who shows up on the scene? Yeshua, ben David, son of David. Now, let me interweave what we saw already. Remember, Rosh Chodesh is called Yom Kippur Katan. And remember some of the inserts, the part of the Rosh Chodesh liturgy. And a Redeemer will come to Zion and will turn away transgression in Jacob, says the Lord. And it's that same text, that the great rabbi of old cites in Romans 11:26. Rav Shaul says, "And then all Israel will be saved." Notice the interweaving. On a time called Mini Yom Kippur is a time we also reflect on the Redeemer who comes to Zion, the one through whom all Israel will in fact be delivered. All of this points us then to Yeshua and the perspective that we remember each week when we do Ha Elohim Asher, or when we do Revelations 5 and 7 as our Tehilat Abit Chadashah, the Messiah actually on the throne of David. Last week, Yom HaAliyah, Ascension Day, reminded us or pictured Yeshua's ascension to the throne. And that in turn leads us to 5 days later, Rosh Chodesh, which points to Yeshua's coronation as king. That's part of the picture here. We draw our faith and our hope from these prayers as Jews and those who've joined us. And as we look towards the moon, we express our total faith in the God who orders the cycles and seasons. We recognize that the disappearance of the moon is a guaranteed indication of what? Its reappearance. And so we entreat our God to restore the kingdom of David to its original glory and splendor. Similarly, speedily, in our days, as we will in fact continue when we respond with the Elena. As yet another psalm reminds us, Psalm 89, verse 37, God says, I have sworn to David that his dynasty will go on forever, and his throne will continue to the end of time. It will be eternal as the moon, my faithful witness in the sky. In the meantime, we realize that, or we need to realize that, like the moon, we too need to change and develop, to grow and move on to maturity. Always in process, always moving from one campsite to the next, journeying with God. And so we should recommit ourselves to keep in step with, or in this particular case, keep in time with the God who goes with us, as he did with our ancestors in the wilderness. If that is in fact your commitment, express that now in this time of silent reflection as we respond, as we recall what this holiday is all about.